Thanks very much, Christina, and good afternoon, folks. Excuse me. Rob Ward from the Centre for Recording Achievement. I'm, in a sense, the person that just picks up the baton from Christina. I'm going to say a little bit by introduction about Europortfolio, just to create a context. And in doing that, I just want to give some special thanks to colleagues Sarah, Shane, and Peter, who are going to follow on from me. And I will return later on to say a little bit about how we're going to develop Europortfolio in the UK context. But this bit is really about scene setting. And part of that is clearly to introduce Europortfolio as a group of institutions to you. This is a European project, 3-year project, with a range of colleagues involved in the delivery and development of the project, led by colleagues in Croatia, but behind the labels you will, I think, come to identify a number of colleagues who are established in the world of ePortfolios. So the French link takes you to Serge Ravet, who many of will have attended conferences that Serge has organised. Clearly it's ourselves in the UK working with Lisa and colleagues in JISC, and I managed to change the JISC label so it has lowercase as well as uppercase. And colleagues across a range of contexts, including links to the US, which links directly to Darren Cambridge and colleagues at the International Coalition for Electronic Portfolio Research. And as of yesterday, that group was joined at the Europortfolio portal, which is europortfolio.org. There are 285 registered members of that group currently, representing 49 countries, and we've already expanded well beyond Europe, given that Europe doesn't have all those countries. Our main goal is simple but huge. I think it's always going to be a work in progress, and it's really to build networking capacity in a range of contexts, but particularly these 4 areas. And we're doing that, in a sense, through 3 main routes. We are developing a network. A network of people who come from a range of contexts, and so this is intended to be a very inclusive network. Not just people who live, breathe, wake up thinking about, go to bed thinking about ePortfolios, but actually a group that is people who are using technology, and particularly ePortfolio technology, in their practice, but don't necessarily think of themselves as experts. They're users in a whole variety of ways. We want to develop the community portal, which will have a number of project outputs listed within it, and I flagged those there. And last but not least, we're developing a series of local chapters. This is the 7th, I think, in the group, to take forward work across platforms, to bring together people who are interested in ePortfolios, but not necessarily restricted to a particular technological solution, not necessarily restricted to a particular sector, not necessarily ultimately restricted to a particular context. And so that's really where today comes in. Local chapters are groups with connections to bigger projects, but we also have the chance to pay attention to key issues that matter to us in the UK. And much of the rest of this session is going to be picking up on those, on 3 of them at least, in terms of user perspectives with Sarah, in terms of technical and technology with Shane, and in terms of the research agenda with Peter. So we're delighted to welcome all of them. I'll be back later on. For now, just to emphasise that what we're going to do is to hear the contributors. If you have issues you want to pick up in the moment, please put them in the chat box, and we will pay attention to those between each of the contributors very briefly, providing the time doesn't run away from us. If you've got questions you want to raise in a more interactive way, there will be some time at the end for discussion and we'll organise that when we get to that point. So immediate stuff, put it in the chat box, we'll pick it up very briefly as we go, discussion towards the end, and I will be back at that point. And at this point I'm going to turn off my microphone, and the next voice you hear, with a bit of luck, will be Sarah Chesney's. Thanks very much for now.
There we go. Hopefully that bit of luck has transferred and you can all hear me. Hello everybody. Can you just signal in, perhaps using the icons, that you can hear me, and then I'll proceed. Yeah, brilliant. Good. Okay then. Let's start. Emerging challenges and opportunities. I'm Sarah Chesney and I'm going to talk about emerging challenges and opportunities from a staff and a student perspective. I'm going to draw upon my role as an educational developer responsible for ePortfolios at the University of Cumbria. I'm going to draw upon experiences of other colleagues that I've come into contact with, mainly Jeremy Benson, who was at Cumbria after I left, and also lessons I've learned since leaving in 2010 as a freelance. I'm going to pick out the role of the ePortfolio practitioner as an example of the type of learner we're encouraging on our students and in ourselves as members of staff. So let's start with a reminder of why we use ePortfolios. The purposes are usually the same, whether they are being used by staff or by students. The most commonly cited reasons for use are that ePortfolios are an excellent tool for supporting the process of learning and creating a product. However, we mustn't forget that in amongst all the talk about supporting learning, there is often sometimes a hidden purpose, and that's being able to be more efficient and potentially save costs. Many of us shy away from even mentioning this, even if it's a key driver for senior managers who are involved in procurement. It's also worth reminding ourselves why using an ePortfolio is so important to those of us, probably everybody in the room, who advocate this approach. One of the strengths is that ePortfolios have grown out of a pedagogical need designed along the theories of reflection in much the same way Moodle is designed along social constructivist theories. However, with ePortfolio practice, before it could really establish its roots, it was connected to the PDP agenda, and so ever since has been closely aligned. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but we know that the pedagogy underpinning the ePortfolio is not restricted to PDP. As the case studies JISC has collected demonstrate, ePortfolio practice supports a number of key activities in any learner's journey. Therefore, we shouldn't be asking ourselves questions like how we can embed ePortfolio practice in assessment practices or to support the employability agenda, but instead how we can use ePortfolios to support the learning culture within an institution. This would then naturally include staff to support their continuing professional development. Many of you will be familiar with this image, but it demonstrates, with thanks to Pebble Learning for it, but it demonstrates that an ePortfolio can be used to support many educational and professional touch points. All the topics mentioned on this slide don't just involve one member of staff using an ePortfolio with their students. They also involve other stakeholders, for example, help desk, human resources, professional bodies, other colleagues, employers, mentors. You get the idea, a complex situation that requires a lead who is willing to take on a challenge and very often return to a challenge again and again. This lead has to be prepared to justify why they use an ePortfolio to a range of stakeholders. This will continue to be a challenge as staff turnover occurs and senior managers change. I was a critical friend to a range of JISC transformations program projects, and one of the recurring challenges for a number of the projects was the impact when a supportive member of the senior management changed. In this sector we are seeing a lot of change, so we now have to expect that we have to revisit and re-explain the benefits the use of an ePortfolio brings. Today's webinar title is Emerging Challenges and Opportunities, with my section specifically looking at emergent roles. When you look at this diagram, think about how the different skills that a learner needs when they come into contact with all these activities. Of course, they won't be active in all of the areas, but they will be in a range of them. The same can be said for staff. So with this in mind, why don't we have a look in more detail at the skills or attributes the ePortfolio practitioner needs in order to meet the challenges. And so I would argue that we're going to be looking at an emergent role here. Robert Saffian, editor of Fast Company, says we are living in an age of flux and have to be naturally at ease with uncertainty, something ePortfolio practitioners need to be aware of. In order for ePortfolios to avoid being vulnerable to a lack of senior management support or senior management changing, the champion, or slightly humorously I've called it the heptagonist, needs to have multiple identities in order to respond to uncertainty. And in fact, there needs to be a number of this type of person in an institution. If you are attending this webinar, you are likely to be a heptagonist, but let's look in more detail what that means. Here we have the teacher. It's fairly obvious that the teacher would be there within this job description. They're there to support their students and support learning. The mentor is probably a compulsory part of the job description if you are going to be an ePortfolio practitioner. You'll be supporting colleagues, whether this is formally or informally, within a program team or maybe even across faculty. You're also in the early stages in particular, you'll be looking at being a learning technologist to support students to use the ePortfolio or even other colleagues. Maybe this role reduces as things like the help desk come on board and people become more familiar and confident in using an ePortfolio. Underpinning everything is the reflective practitioner who is continually reviewing practice and looking for ways to improve. And I've picked out specifically there because at the moment there is this emphasis on the UK PSF and the need to demonstrate that you are remaining in good standing for staff, especially if your role takes on teaching. The researcher part of the role is often ignored, possibly because of the time it takes, but it is really quite a vital part of it because we need to start providing evidence that work with the portfolios is enhancing learning, and we also need to be able to show how it is perhaps cost effective and it provides us with a more efficient use of providing feedback and issues like that. So often I would argue that perhaps we haven't been paying enough attention to the researcher role as part of our ePortfolio practitioner. The publicist needs to be drawn out there. We need to be able to correct misconceptions, share best practice, and really tell our story both within the institution and externally. And finally, we need to be an informed advocate. We need to be aware of the context in which we're operating and be a credible person for the portfolio, for advancing the ePortfolio practice. This might not mean an in-depth knowledge of interoperability, but you need to be aware of what it is and why it's useful to know a little bit about it. Let's have a look at the challenges here. Challenges arise when the process itself straddles a different process and there is no acknowledgement of the gap. We have to be able to acknowledge that there is a gap and that this needs expertise to be able to address it. We're not just talking about a technical problem here, we're talking about value and audience. For example, potential employers, do they value the work that a student has done or a member of staff has done in their ePortfolio? And when it comes to recognition of workload, that there may be some efficiencies, we also need to be very firm in deciding what we will adopt and what we will drop from our workload. This is sometimes not a choice that we can make. but it is important to acknowledge that we do need to be quite firm with ourselves about what we're going to take up and what we're going to cease doing in order to remain, well, basically competent and not overworked. If we look at two examples of challenges, we're looking at, if I just pick out two, innovative assessment and staff CPD. ePortfolios may be a solution, but tension arises if this is at odds with the discipline, the institutional culture, learner expectations, and even who is funding the learning. And this can often be exacerbated when we lose someone like the heptagonist. We lose that sophisticated practitioner with all those multiple identities. So finally, success will really only be achieved if we have senior management, support, vocal endorsement, and I would argue ongoing scrutiny, which we sometimes try and avoid. We need to be looking at you know, the data, being able to sell the ePortfolio and look at how it can support institutional agendas, and actually be quite upfront about this. We have to be able to present the evidence to an audience, predict successes and anticipate workload and costs, and be prepared to discuss this at a senior level. This means that success is reliant on the ePortfolio practitioner and the combination of the software. We need to be able to demonstrate efficiencies on a large scale. We need to be able to point to retention, grades, graduate jobs as evidence of our success. And we also should be used to using the software to generate some of those statistics. So finally, in conclusion, I'm sorry to have to tell you this isn't going to happen. There isn't a finishing line. We will have to keep playing the multiple role job if we're going to be successful and be lifelong learners. I think we all know that. Our students, if higher education has provided the right opportunities, will be capable of refreshing existing skills and acquire new ones. I often hear this as a reason for using an ePortfolio. It provides students with the opportunity to hone digital skills. But the approach has to apply to us, and we have to be comfortable with the changing role of the ePortfolio practitioner if the challenges in the sector are to be met. To quote Kevin Kelly, you will be a newbie forever, but I would add we are not going to get through this without networking, which is one of the reasons why we're here today. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I'm not sure there's anything we desperately need to pick up in chat, so with a reminder for you to make use of that facility if things occur to you, let's move on and invite Shane to pick up the baton in terms of moving the technology discussion forwards a little bit, though anticipating Shane, I'm sure it won't just be about technology. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everybody. Let's move on to my first slide. So, yeah, I was asked to talk about emerging technical possibilities, and I think it's kind of problematic. I've got 10 minutes or so, and I could spend the 10 minutes just listing things, which I thought would be a bad idea. A little bit about me. A tiny bit about me. I've written ePortfolio Expert. I mean, I'm not sure any of us are experts, and I guess I've probably been to more ePortfolio conferences and events than most of the people in the room. Since starting in the whole portfolio world at Wolverhampton in 2004. But I think ePortfolio is problematic in so much as it describes so many different kinds of systems and approaches. So expert status actually is a bit of a sort of strange concept. I've chosen to just include 4, I guess, technical issues or observations, and sadly, all the animations are stripped out by Blackboard. The first picture is meant to be the guy on the right-hand side, just to point out that everywhere you turn now, people are on their mobiles. but not in the sense that picture portrays, actually. He's talking on his phone, and that's something that we do less and less of. We use our phones as mobile computers. And you can see from the little chart on the left-hand side that in January, for the first time, these are US statistics, but it's a pretty global trend, that people spent more time accessing the internet on mobile apps than they did from a desktop computer. And if you add to that the total amount of browsing on a mobile, you can see how important mobile is to accessing things on the web. And of course, ePortfolios are things on the web. Now, it's quite easy with things on the web to pick up a small form and do a simple reflection in the moment, or on the bus between campuses, or after you've taught a lesson. But people want to do more and more sophisticated things. They want to be able to fill in complex templates. They want to be able to add video and all those kinds of things. And the traditional mobile device, as in the phone, which we often think of, has some limitations in that respect. And I think the biggest change we've seen recently has been the wide-scale adoption of tablet devices. Again, the animation doesn't allow you to see, but tablet devices means you also have to start redesigning software to make use of that functionality. So big finger-friendly buttons, that kind of thing. But what they have really done is allowed us to get into places which were previously resistant to ePortfolios. And I'm thinking particularly of medical and healthcare settings, where there was a particular love affair with paper, and actually a difficulty of accessing technology. Often there would be a single computer on a ward used for patient records and not for learning. So the arrival of the tablet has meant that a lot of paper-based processes, so that observation of clinical skills, has now been able to be replicated on tablets. And in many examples, trainee nurses and other practitioners record the skill they've done. They hand over their device, and you can see here, using their very pointy finger, the consultant provides a digital signature, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because the technology gives us this fabulous opportunity to do things differently. But actually, the final hurdle to overcome is that people still like signing, even though signing things is much easier to afford than actually logging in. So the increased use of mobile is a big factor in how we design both the software and the processes around ePortfolio. So this one is kind of at odds with that first one, the increasing importance of offline. And we do quite a bit of work in Australia, and you can imagine in Australia there are issues in rural communities with access to reasonable internet access. But it's not just that. I've already talked about the medical context, and one of the issues is in wards still. In many places there isn't Wi-Fi, so it doesn't matter how good your provision of smartphones or tablet devices is. If you can't connect to the internet, you're somewhat stuffed. The same is true in many military contexts, and although that's not exactly an airliner hovering over Queensland, we do have, we work with an airline where their senior cabin crew use ePortfolios to record their competencies. They reflect on the premature baby they delivered on the flight, or the drunken passenger, and of course there's an awful lot, if you're flying to Australia, there's an awful lot of reflective time available to you, and you don't have necessarily access to the internet. Although of course this problem of offline may go away. There are big projects to roll out Wi-Fi across hospitals, driven mainly by concern for patients and giving them access to the internet, but of course consultants and trainees will all have opportunity to access that too. And even airlines now are introducing the Wi-Fi. So this is a particular problem at the moment, and I think it's a particular problem because all of a sudden ePortfolio technologies are being taken much more seriously. They're being used much more purposefully to attend to real core processes. And the concerns that people have around really good access to the internet are being, if you like, surfaced in concern for what you might do if you don't have that access. I was going to talk very briefly about the problems with offline access. It kind of doesn't matter in a way, and it's a shame you can't see the form underneath. This form here really has three simple boxes: what, so what, and now what. That's really easily replicated in an app. But more and more we're seeing much more sophisticated use of the technologies. This is called a workbook. It doesn't matter, it's just in effect a complex portfolio. And it's really hard to have that synchronized with a device that you then disappear off on placement, fill in and synchronize later. So there are lots of challenges around offline access, which I hope will go away if we get much better access wherever we happen to be working. This is the one slide I really hoped would build bit by bit, because there's a lot on it. So this is point number 3, the centrality of assessment and how technology can support assessment. And the story sort of goes like this. We have a student on placement, in this case he's in Dubai. He's one of 20 students that I look after, and that 20 is part of a much larger group of 467 looked after by 45 of us. Sorry, not 40, that's bad maths, 20 odd of us. This particular student had a visa problem. He has 14 different external assessors. His portfolio has to be assessed at least 3 times. Most of the feedback's repetitive, but it's also conversational. The final assessment, though, is really complex, and it must be second marked and moderated. And the university has a policy about plagiarism, and all the grades must go straight to the VLE, the centre of the universe. So we have to have solutions to these kind of things. And of course, ePortfolios themselves are accessible anywhere, which is wonderful. We have to have easy ways of organising people into sets, so that only the people responsible for users who are assessing their work can see it. And that, again, is particularly important in healthcare settings, because if you don't have, if you have students making reflections on their interactions with patients, of course with all sorts of rules and protocols around that, but you still want to make sure that only the people responsible for those students can see their work, and the same is true for externals. You need to allow individual extensions, because any kind of friction in the system that requires lots of effort from teachers managing unusual circumstances, friction means people will stop using the tools, and it becomes much harder. You may be able to sell a really strong pedagogical kind of argument, but as soon as the technology gets in the way at all and starts creating friction, you have to overcome that. One of our customers has something like 200 students out on placement, with 800 externals managing them. And that's a really, if I think about the drivers for portfolios in particular at the moment, one of the main drivers is around placement-based learning or work-based learning as part of sandwich courses and the like. So allowing things like pausing, so if a portfolio is assessed many, many times, being able to stop it while the student's on placement, they carry on working on it, but the assessors see that as it was at a point in time. Comment banks, you know, I could carry on going through all of these. But assessment is a really, really important part of the piece. And the reason it's a really important part of the piece is because portfolios are being used much more within the curriculum. They're not a sort of add-on to the curriculum. And we find that in the next slide. So we use the portfolios that look a bit like this. These are all About Me portfolios. But the technology used to create these About Me portfolios is exactly this, you know, allows you to do all sorts of other really exciting things. Those About Me portfolios fall into 3 categories, but we're seeing much more. I'm speaking obviously with my knowledge of our system, but I know this is also happening with practitioners that use Mahara and other tools. They're using the portfolio technology to get students to not write about them, but write about the things they did. In the first example, surfacing the process of learning. So for example, with us at Sydney, they're doing lab reports, or lab experiments in fact, but the whole of the lab experiment is written up in the form of a portfolio. Placement is an obvious one as well. At Nottingham, they have students who create very, very rich placement documents that include visas, passport details, action in the event of emergency, travel plans, all sorts of things related to their placement, which aren't about them, but contain really rich information, which is just using or leveraging the technology. And my final example is the production portfolio. So this is where students are asked to perhaps research a bunch of subjects and to produce what in effect is a learning object about the subject they researched. They're all shared amongst the group, and all of a sudden we have community-created resources of real value and presumably also exportable and takeawayable depending on the system you're using. So these were my 4 points. There are many, many more I could have added, but the increasing importance of mobile, increasing importance of offline, the centrality of assessment, and making sure the technology doesn't provide any friction in this. And then leverage the technology. The technology is developed wonderfully. Leverage it to make really good use of it in the curriculum and not just to have people tell stories about themselves. So, Rob, that's me finished.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Shane. There's some good networking going on in the chat box. And yes, we can certainly provide access to the slides. No substantive issues, I don't think, in there. So this is just to remind you that in a minute we'll hear from Peter Hartley about the research agenda, which I think will connect into some of the discussion we've already had. Sarah mentioned it. In a sense, it's underpinning some of the things that Shane's been saying. And then, folks, there'll be time for chat. So if you're thinking about issues you want to come back to, in about 12 minutes or so will be your opportunity before we call around on the issue about how we go forward as a UK chapter in the context of Europortfolio. So I'll shut up and I'll hand on. I'm delighted to hand on to Peter Hartley, who looks younger every time I see him. Thanks very much, Peter.
And it is indeed fortunate that we do not have video presentation this morning, so you could test the quality of Rob's comment there. Welcome from sunny Scotland. I'm Peter Hartley. As you can see there, I have still got a relationship with the University of Bradford where many of these comments come from, but I'm now working independently, and there's a current email if you want to follow up anything that I say or get more detail on the slides. This presentation, well, I was asked to do this presentation, I think, by Rob, because I did a presentation back in 2010 to a CRA event with Darren Cambridge, whose name has already come up today. So this gave me an opportunity to revisit the presentation. So these are a combination of slides from myself and Darren, dating back to 2010 with some updating and some new thoughts. And I thought I'd actually start by going back to 2010 to see where we were then, where ePortfolios was on the Gartner hype cycle. Now, I suspect many of you have seen this before, the idea that technology is triggered, that there's then a peak of inflated expectations where everybody thinks that this technology will resolve the problems of the world. There's then some disillusionment, and you then enter what they call the slope of enlightenment, where we begin to realize what the technology can do and then develop on from there. Now, in terms of going back to 2010, ePortfolios were on the slope of enlightenment. And as you can see from the color coding there, that meant that mainstream adoption was only between 2 and 5 years away. So, and of course, ePortfolio has now disappeared from the hype cycle. So does this mean that they are now a mature and embedded technology? And that's perhaps one of the most general research questions that we can ask ourselves today. I haven't got a statistic for UK use in terms of universities and colleges, but I did come across the latest version of the International Journal of ePortfolio, which suggests that 40% of American colleges and universities now are using ePortfolios. Now, is that good news that there's 40% of usage, or is that actually bad news that the majority of institutions are not using ePortfolios? And you'll see in my third bullet there that I suggest, or I question, are ePortfolios now the educational equivalent of the essential kitchen gadget? How many have you got a George Foreman grill or a sandwich toaster at the back of your kitchen cupboard, which everybody had to have at one point, and possibly everybody still has, but they're just not used? It's only about a month ago that I came across myself an example of an institution using ePortfolios simply at a document store. In other words, a complete waste of time. So, where are ePortfolios now? If we talk about what we know, and these, I'm not going to talk through every bullet on the remaining slides, but I've left them all in so that you can pick some of these ideas up later if you wish. But I've tried to highlight a key issue in blue on the next few slides, because this is going back to what I said, what Darren and I talked about 3 or 4 years ago in terms of what we know, and we definitely do know, as Shane has just alluded to, that there's some very strong differences between different initiatives with different assumptions, different approaches and organizations. And I see the comment from on the chat box that depending on which subject and which department we're now looking at, they're probably somewhere on the hype cycle, some yet to start. And whether institutions will start with ePortfolios, well, I'll come back to that later. We certainly know that ePortfolios have an impact on learning, and perhaps the phrase to, or the word to highlight in that first bullet point is that some students on some courses. So I don't think we still have a view as to how it suits everyone, and I'll come back to that point later. So it has an impact on learning. We also know that the role of the academic tutor is absolutely critical. And again, the point about the expert who leaves and has a very kind of dampening effect on ePortfolio take-up in a department or institution. Again, I think my experience certainly suggests that, and that's a very kind of common experience across the board. Institutional contexts, that it does require ongoing and long-term support, and perhaps one thing I should add into that bullet is the financial support. Does the institution have the necessary resources to keep the thing going if it's made a major investment? That's certainly one organizational journey that I've been involved with in terms of moving from the vision through to commitment, through to an actual product, through to an actual plan, and to roll out and embedding. But of course, one of the problems with overall diagrams like this is that they do not show you all the little hiccups, all the little loops that go on within each of those boxes. So for example, you might get organizational commitment in principle, but does that mean you have the finance to get it going? And I think that Carol Higginson, my former colleague from Bradford, is in the audience today, who might well be wanting to chip in with lots of examples of how that journey, which in many ways was very successful, has not perhaps embedded itself in the institution as we originally perhaps hoped across all faculties. So we know about institutional contacts, and we also, I'd like to highlight that final point, that ePortfolios can be extremely disruptive in the positive sense of the term, whereby they do require transformative change throughout the university to fulfill their potential. So I'll move very quickly through those slides, and please pick them up later and follow me up on anything you wish. But I think one of the interesting things is that we are now in a new context for ePortfolios, because so much has changed both technologically and in terms of the context for universities of the last 4 or 5 years. And trying to put that together into one slide, I would suggest that there are a number of, if you like, supporting factors, things that are actually going to help us move forward with ePortfolios. The advent of HERE, employability agendas, the focus in a number of institutions on digital literacy and what have you, and new and more accessible technology. There are factors which may work in either direction, and the competition between universities may well have some universities moving much more towards employability, but perhaps other universities will have will think of a different focus. And I think there are very strong impeding factors that institutions, given the new competition, may well become more risk averse. I can certainly suggest that there's a lack of an ePortfolio culture. Sorry, I just noticed a spelling mistake on that slide. A lack of ePortfolio culture in academic staff. And again, little employer enthusiasm in some areas. So students may be persuaded about the value by staff, but they'll be looking outside the institution to see, well, is this going to really help in my kind of long-term development? And I certainly know that the things that I've been involved with, it's been very much a case of the most successful ePortfolio initiatives I have seen have been those where the employer link at the end has been particularly strong. So I think we are moving into a new context. And of course, this diagram, of course, gives us a whole set of potential for research. So if we're trying to translate that into real questions, we still need to know about long-term impact. I think we still need to know how many ePortfolio platforms we really need. I think we need to know much more about underlying psychological processes and factors. You know, different types of students require different strokes. Will a portfolio system be able to cater for all that? And some of those other points have already been kind of alerted in previous slides. So there's a lot I think we still need to know. And the most fundamental question, I suspect, given the new context of Web 2 and Web 3, is has the ePortfolio system, as envisaged by quite a number of institutions, and certainly ones that I've been involved with, had its day. So we need research. We need more research, and in particular, I'd highlight the points about sharing methods, sharing approaches, comparing data across institutions, and evaluating long-term impact. But also, I suspect, going back to that first bullet point on that page, we need more research on what students and staff really do, as opposed to what they tell us they do. And I think we have lots of research which perhaps focuses much more on what they say they do rather than what they really do. One of the best presentations I ever saw about reflective practice came from a group who turned around to me at the end and said, well, actually, we don't believe this stuff. We just really want to be told what to do. So on that cheerful note, I think the prospect of developing more collaboration across institutions in the way that Rob is about to describe, linking up research, linking up practice, is perhaps the important question in terms of what do we really need to know about ePortfolios. And my iPod tells me I've done 10 minutes.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Peter.
That is a clue for Rob to come and talk.
Yeah. Sorry, Peter, go on. You've got 2
That's
minutes
a clue
left.
for you to talk.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Peter. Peter gave me his word as a gentleman that he would not exceed 12 minutes, and I always knew he was a gentleman. Folks, I'm not going to bat straight into the issue about where we might take the Europortfolio agenda, because it seems to me lots of things have been raised by colleagues, and I want to give you a bit of time just to reflect on them if you want to, using the chat facility. And as I understand that you have a hand-raising facility for that, which is on the box, which on my screen is labeled participants on the left-hand side. I'm thinking, though, that apart from having learned a new word from Sarah, which is antagonist, that there's kind of a number of themes in what's been said across the contributors. Redeveloping the case for new audiences in the context of change, which is something Sarah left with me. Shame, the complexity, but also the opportunity of technology and so on. And Peter's recognition that we are in complex environments, that we do have to have the evidence to support redeveloping the case, which Sarah talked about, but also lots of the research agenda that Peter, you picked up were about kind of what we might call internal dynamics, how people do stuff rather than what they're using. And we can come back to that in a minute or two in the context of a European agenda, or a wider agenda, because it doesn't just necessarily across institutions, disciplines, it is potentially national. But I want to shut up and give people a chance to raise any issues or make any observations verbally that we want to bring to the proceedings, and we will take about 10 minutes for that, and then maybe I'll just wrap up in terms of what we're going to do and invite you to do in the context of your portfolio next. So I'm now going to take a big risk, which is I'm going to turn off my microphone and I'm going to see if there's an interest amongst the audience in becoming more participative. Thanks very much.
May I ask a question then, please? Rob, I'm going to ask it anyway. Peter has talked about research, and I know that that means a particular thing, but I feel quite strongly, and I wonder what other people think, if that we could broaden out the word research to include things like keeping track of how much money we're saving if we use e-portfolios, what efficiencies can be gained. And I know this isn't necessarily of interest to people who are really keen to support learning, but I think it would sometimes back up the case. So sort of research with a small r rather than, say, research and publishing in peer-reviewed journals. So I just wondered what people felt about sort of a wider research list of things.
Okay, so that's
just to comment back there, Sarah. I think I would have a very general definition of research as well. I think we need much more information about, again, what people really do, and the kind of not just the planned benefits that people get out of e-portfolios, but also the bits of serendipity as to what it does, for example, to staff-student relationships.
So there's part of that is around recognizing that there might be other value which institutions might recognize in terms of efficiency, but Peter's arguing as well for getting behind the procedure in terms of what really goes on, and I suspect there's some interesting stuff in that. Laura and Kathy, we're having a bit of a discussion in the chat context. Shane, Laura's picked something up for yourself there about medical schools and offline access and so on. Kathy's responded. Shane, do you want to say anything in that context?
Yeah, I was partway through a response. I think as I've just written, we're hearing more and more about the need for offline, and that alone puts it really high on our agenda. The problem is we have to have discussion. That's not the problem. It's a great thing about hopefully the way, if you like the way we work, we talk to customers to find out what's going on. We need to have a conversation with them because, as I stated, Roger mentioned an app, and I don't know about the app, and it's super that there is an offline app, but he talks about being able to organise files and synchronize them later on. That's very different to how our system is used, where there's lots of scaffolding in the system. And in a medical context, for example, there would be, what happens often is medical schools will have complex workbooks which have pages of both content and competencies, and some of those competencies are released as a time-released thing. So once you've completed some, you get the next batch of competencies. Some things only are triggered once an assessor has signed something off. All of those complications make offline work really, really difficult. And what we have to establish is what's the right trade-off point? Where do we lose some complexity to gain the offline capability, you know, how much is acceptable? And it's really, this offline thing has really only happened, I would say, in the last, I don't know, 6 to 12 months, but particularly in the last 6 to 3 months, or 3 to 6 months, it's become a real issue. And I think part of that also is being, and this is really interesting because I think it reflects on the growing maturity of, and I really don't like the term ePortfolio, but I know we're stuck with it. But the increased maturity of these kinds of systems, because you know, medical schools, which have been really resistant to using technology like this, all of a sudden realize how essential it is to them to maintain a sense of their learners' development, being able to engage with them on a regular basis wherever they are, to bring in lots of other stakeholders, so the consultants and their assessors and the like. So I think, you know, there's something about the maturity of the concept of ePortfolio that's making it much more important to institutions, that's making some really high-stakes programs that wouldn't have touched it with a barge pole a few years ago want to use it, which is all of a sudden raising kind of issues that we've not encountered before, and this one in particular around offline storage. So the fact it's an issue which affects the way people work means it's important to us. We just have to negotiate with our customers to work out how much we can achieve and what's acceptable for them. That's a very long answer. I apologise for that, but hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks, Shane. We're going to run out of time, I fear, and I'm anxious to avoid death by 1,000 people leaving Lodge because we haven't got 1,000 people with us. But just to give a minute or so, Gordon, do you want to come back, because we haven't really talked about the how of research, and you've just raised an issue about appreciative inquiry as a methodology, and that really does relate a bit, I think, to Peter's point about getting the dynamics of what's going on, as well as sort of big picture evaluation stuff. So, Gordon, do you want to say anything else about that at this point? If you do, that's great. And if not, I'll just say very briefly a little bit about the Europortfolio agenda from here on. Thanks. Always hard to know what silence means. Gordon is writing something, I think. Peter, you've picked up the point about appreciative inquiry, and maybe that's something we can come back to. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gordon. Let me just say a little bit then, in just finishing up about next steps from here. I was thinking as people were talking that I didn't hear a lot that was entirely UK specific in terms of the issues that people were raising. They were endemic, they had a wider applicability, and indeed people talked about working in other parts of the world, not least in Australia with Shane's wonderful graphics, including a mega airliner. I just wanted to say a couple of things around where Europortfolio is going, and an invitation to you individually, if you aren't already involved, to get involved. This slide just lists the definition that partners came to at the last project meeting, where in a sense we tried to move a little bit away from just thinking about ePortfolios and getting ourselves siloed in that particular context, but about using technology effectively and appropriately, and about being a community that's interested in sharing together, in knowledge from each other, and actually in developing some new practice and some new perspectives on practice. And then there's my kind of killer question, which is not the one to come to in about 3 minutes of a 1 hour, which is why join another group? Why should we join another group? Why should we ask you to? And I think we have 2 options to offer you in that context. We think there's some value in joining this group because it has a different perspective. It's not platform specific, it's not UK specific. We can actually engender a debate in the context of the increasing mobility of our students, which will connect practice across environments, including into the US, with Darren and colleagues involved as associate partners. But if you want to get actively involved, and this is an invitation, we'd really like you to head for Europortfolio.org, where you can register at the site if you haven't already done so. You can read and sign the Europortfolio Charter with attempts to give expression to what we're interested in. You can contribute your ideas and experiences. You can add information. You can contribute to the site itself and or the newsletter, which is a bi-monthly opportunity which you can receive. You can get involved in open webinars internationally. We've had 3 of those so far, and an open online seminar last week. And we want to build, and we're going to build, a facility for collaboration. Collaboration isn't defined in terms of geographical boundaries, but in terms of people's interests and what we can learn from one another. And very clearly also we want people to participate in UK events, which, as I said, will be platform independent and will connect us into much wider agendas. So we hope you'll go for the option that looks at an active involvement, but if you don't, there's a keeping in touch option. We will be using existing UK lists at ALT with JISC and the ePortfolio, the PDP and ePortfolio list to let you know what's coming up in a wider context, but you will still need to sign in and have this event to be able to attend those. And you'll miss out on some of the things that we're doing. 2 next steps, immediate next steps. We, with some collaboration from JISC colleagues, are going to revisit the 2005 survey that we carried out on behalf of the Higher Education Academy in the near future, to test a bit to Peter's context that we haven't necessarily, the issues in 2010 are still the issues in the present day. So there will be a short survey opportunity to contribute. We're looking at doing that across the Europortfolio network, which could give us some very interesting comparative data, though it won't in any sense taking away the dimension around student engagement, appreciative inquiry, and actually students themselves undertaking appreciative inquiry activities, and we had an example of that at the CRA residential from the University of Worcester. And the other next step is you might want to sign in for the next Europortfolio webinar, which is looking at badges and ePortfolio practice. And this is a growing area in the US, in Australia, and in the UK as well. We're planning 1 webinar a month for the next 18 months. And we're looking forward to people joining as participants, but also as contributors. So that's me done, really. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much, particularly to the presenters. Please do remember that this is a group which is about community development in the UK and more widely, and actually we can't do that without the active involvement of community colleagues, and we'll all be enriched by that. And if we were starting now, the chat box is really moving along. Thank you for your attention. It's been great to be with you for the last hour or so. Please sign up at the portal if you want to keep engaged directly. Otherwise, we will, from time to time, discreetly enter your email inbox and let you know about stuff that you won't quite have the handle on the steering wheel of the project that you would if you joined by. So thank you very much for your attention and time, and from the CRA here in slightly cloudy Wigan, good afternoon.